Hi, welcome to this week's lecture material for Soccer 1010, and the topic this week is on social selves. Basically what we're looking at is ideas of socialization and more at a symbolic interactionist level that we've mentioned in the past as being one of the key theoretical traditions in sociology. So I'll be breaking up the lecture into these four parts on socialization and deviance and difference, power, bodies and technology, and concluding with recent ideas around individualization. So, part one, socialization. Very broadly here, we can kind of think about what we're talking about that fits into broader debates around the almost age-old struggle over nature versus nurture. These are kind of deep philosophical questions around what it means to be a human, how much is kind of determined by our biology, about our genes and DNA and stuff like that, and how much are humans produced by society, kind of about that produced solely through notions of socialization. And these philosophical debates are played out over hundreds of years, have different versions of them going on in different disciplines, and really the sensible position is that somewhere in between both of these kind of aspects have influence over how humans become what they are. On one end of the debate, you have biological determinism, kind of argues that we're completely determined by the kind of nature side. On the other side, you have cultural determinism, that we're solely the products of society, and really more sensible positions tend to take on either side of that dichotomy. These debates, I suppose, have been expressed in many key events around the world. They often, the way that a particular group may define another set of humans, particularly through eugenics, a very biologically determinist point of view, has led to things like World War II and the mass genocide of the Holocaust. So these debates, I suppose, and the way that the social thought around these are not just kind of theory in many ways, they affect the way people practice, the way that people behave, and the way that we relate to other people and categorize them or not. Throughout the course, we've been looking at the sociological imagination and personal troubles and public issues, and these debates speak to those as well. In the last couple of decades, as science becomes even more knowledgeable about what makes up the physical traits of being a human being, genetic issues have come to the fore. The production of genetically modified sheep and genetically modified bits of humans for medical procedures and stuff like that have been able to create good health outcomes and more knowledge about how to treat disease and maybe how we can prevent things. But there's also some kind of fear about what that may mean more in the future. For instance, say if health insurance can somehow kind of get a hold of this information, and you might find yourself having to pay a lot more for your health insurance if you have certain genetic traits in your background. So there's a playoff here between the kind of personal troubles and public issues around the nature and nurture debate as well that's important to consider from a sociological perspective. So there's an increasing, I suppose, understanding of the self as humans through the lens of genetics. And genetics can tell us a lot about a person's ancestry, about their possible health outcomes. And genetics can, link and be identified to show that particular individuals and sometimes groups may have more possibility of getting something like cancer or diabetes and heart disease. But it's really important to then note that these genes do not determine one's life outcome. They're only kind of a precondition for it. There's kind of percentages of probability involved, and certainly environmental factors play a key role in these things as well. A new discipline, scientific discipline around epigenetics also appears to, make complex the boundary between that nature and nurture. This field of study has shown that genes themselves seem to be affected by the environmental conditions and lifestyle choices of parents and grandparents. If those previous generations have gone through, highly stressful situations such as famine and sickness and experiencing violence, this can lead particular genetic markers and can be kind of then handed down through descent. So this is heritable, but it's not deterministic, and these studies show that these kind of markers can also be reversible. So again, the determinism here isn't necessarily definite. Another way of thinking about this kind of nature-nurture debate is what twin studies tend to show, and the one I'm using here is around schizophrenia. For instance, if one identical twin is shown to have a 45% chance, it has schizophrenia, there's a 45% chance that the other twin will develop the same condition. But again, you can see there that's like less than half. The probability is less than half, and there's a bunch, means there's kind of environmental factors and things involved in what that health outcome may be. So in this sense, we're not born a blank slate, but we're not fully determined either. So these are kind of, I suppose, ways of illustrating the different ways that nature and nurture come into play. Twin studies in that sense therefore show that each twin inhabits their own unique environment. A twin's life trajectory then, and their genetic makeup come into kind of play together about who and what a person can be. So, the genes and twin studies kind of highlight the kind of more nature side. What I'm going to talk about now is the more nurture side, which is what sociologists tend to be more interested in. Now, again, the theories that I'm going to talk about here aren't writing out the kind of nature side of things, but thinking more about how our environment, how the socialization process are part of that trajectory. So socialization occurs through processes of rewards and sanctions of behaviours at different times of our lives. So essentially what we are, we're born into the world, into a particular place, a particular family. Our parents have their own histories and traditions and education and jobs and relations and all that kind of stuff. So we're therefore then socialised in the sense that we're influenced about what we start to think is normal, what we think is comfortable, what we think is good and moral and all these things from a very early age through these different layers of socialisation. The primary socialisation is that very early infant stage where you're pretty much just almost wholly and solely influenced by your parents and your very close family members. Infancy and early childhood, where you're sort of copying, viewing what those people around you do and get a sense of yourself and a sense of the world through those relations. Secondary socialisation is as you get a bit older, start moving out, receiving more influences from outside of your immediate family. A bit later in childhood, as you go and play at other people's houses, develop a peer group, start going to school, and stuff like the mass media, watching TV and seeing, getting influenced by what's going on there as well. Another layer of socialisation that was developed later on to think about what happens once we become a bit older is tertiary socialisation. And this kind of looks at the idea that, once you become an adult, 18 or 21 or whatever, you're not then kind of a fully made up person that never changes for the rest of your life. You're not this kind of stable thing. You're still influenced, but by the time you get to that age, you kind of have a set of norms, a set of expectations, a set of understandings that are reasonably stable, but you are still in the process constantly throughout your life of being socialised. And what can be particularly influential at that stage, at the tertiary level, is if you experience a kind of sudden or drastic change in your life. If you're sent to jail, if you have divorce, if you're made redundant from a job, or if you move a country, these can then obviously have some profound effects on the way that you think about yourself and you think about the others and the way you relate to the world. So socialisation, therefore, is this process that we all experience as we're born into the world. As we grow up, we are influenced by the things around us to create a kind of subject position and orientation towards the world. Now, in this lecture this week, I'm going to talk very broadly about this process, but what we'll do later in the course is look at things like class, race and ethnicity, and gender and sexuality to think about some of the kind of deep inequalities that occur in these processes as well. I'll touch on those a little bit in this lecture, but I'm mostly keeping it more broad to understand the process, I suppose. So what we're looking at here is processes of symbolic interactionism. And I think earlier in the course we were talking about there's three traditions of different sociology theories. The kind of critical that kind of follows, Marx, the functional that tends to kind of follow Durkheim. The symbolic interactionist position is tended to be positioned as following Weber, but really it kind of incorporates a lot of different perspectives from the history of sociological thought. But what symbolic interactionism is most interested in is where those kind of other things are kind of thinking about a more macro level of stuff. Symbolic interactionism is the object of study tends to be about specific moments, what happens in a specific space, in the family, in the house, in school, in a shop, or things like that. So symbolic interactionism is interested in the kind of relational and emotional connections that we develop with people and things, and how that affects who we become and what we think. So from this perspective, sense of self is developed through social interactions. Personal meaning is constituted through social encounters. I'm going to go through some kind of really influential ideas about that. Basically, we learn to be a human, we learn to behave in particular ways by observing what other people do. And then we, follow those kind of things through kind of copying. We'll test the waters out in terms of what the limits are of what we can and can't get away with as we're a child. And we'll, be punished for some things and not so much for others. And these kind of set up our socialization processes as a way of kind of thinking in the world and being in the world. George Herbert Mead is particularly influential in this field in terms of what's symbolic interactionism and how the field developed. And he argued there was kind of two parts in dialogue inside the individual: the self and within the self, and they're the I and the me. This is kind of that inner monologue kind of thing going on that many people have. The I is the active aspects of people, the impulses, instincts, behaviours that are not overtly socialised. The me is the social self that conditions the I to behave in ways that suit particular social interactions. So Mead kind of argues that we always have this dialogue going on in our heads. It's not necessarily a voice, it's not necessarily conscious, but like there's this stuff going on that kind of helps guides us through our daily lives in the ways that we interact with others, based on kind of understanding of what's expected by them, based on understandings about what's expected in a particular situation, and ensuring that we tend to conform more often than not to what those expectations are. Charles Horton Cooley also looked at this and thought about how we imagine ourselves, what he called the looking glass self. So here, Cooley wants us to help explain how our sense of self is developed by the ways that we imagine others perceive us. And for Cooley, we use others as a mirror to construct our sense of self. So Cooley talks about this in 3 stages. We imagine how we appear to others. We then observe how they react to us. And then we develop feelings about ourselves based on those judgments we believe others have made about us. And if I can relate this back to the kind of different stages of socialization I was talking about before, this is particularly the case in that primary part where, parents are looking after the baby from an early age. And it happens obviously at school where, teachers start, dishing out punishments for various forms of misbehaviour or whatever. And it happens at a really kind of micro level. I mean, there's studies show that, for instance, that if the way that kind of adults interact with a baby, if they're told that the baby is a male, they'll, pick it up and be a little bit more rough with it than they would be as a female. So this, from a very early everyday level seems to have effects on the way that we're socialised. And again, we'll look at examples of things like that in the week on gender and sexuality. So Cooley's interested in how we imagine ourselves, how we appear to others, how we observe others react to us, and then we kind of regulate our behaviour based on those, whether we kind of feel good about that judgment, whether we feel bad, whether we want to avoid being sanctioned. And sanctioned here are not just kind of punishments from the law, they're kind of, people giving us a dirty look or, the stink eye or the sighing at us, or like, not wanting to be feeling like someone doesn't like you and all that kind of thing. So social sanctions here don't necessarily pertain to like breaking the laws. They're kind of more minute everyday interactions in this sense. My favourite sociologist who has been profoundly influential in this area is Erving Goffman. And he kind of is influenced by what I've been talking about already, and talks about what he calls the dramaturgical analysis. Goffman kind of metaphorically in some ways, but like, conceptually, wants us to think about the way that we behave, the way we perform ourselves in different contexts. So, in terms of socialization, what Goffman talks about is that we are kind of performing our lives as if we're on a stage, but our lives are made up of different stages. Through those socialization processes, we learn the lines of those stages. So you kind of, learn how to be someone's son or daughter, then you might be a little bit different around the grandparents. You kind of learn how to do these things, and you move out into the world and learn how to become a student, how to become, a soccer player, how to become a choir member. And as we get older, we have more of these roles that we take on and then we perform. So we're taking on roles in that sense, like actors on the stage. We kind of understand that there's scripts to be able to play those roles well. And we aim then to present ourselves in the best possible light when we're kind of doing those performances. So what Goffman talks about here, again similar to the previous slides as well, is what he calls impression management. We try to control the way others perceive us by, performing that role well. So, the example I use all the time, particularly in tutorials, is I'll be standing at the front, talking like I am now with my hands. Everyone else is sitting quietly, kind of listening or asking questions, and I respond. In those situations, students are playing the role of student, I'm playing the role of the teacher, but that kind of relation disappears if it's in a different setting. If we were on a sporting field or in a social situation, we would then perform different versions of ourselves. The script in that situation is largely given to us by the institution. So in that teacher-student role, I'm given a kind of more power because of the hierarchy. But again, that kind of relation of power disappears once we move out of that social system. Goffman also talked about what he called the backstage. So we're always kind of on stage, and even when we're by ourselves, we have that kind of monologue, I, me thing going on. But there's more situations, I suppose, where we can be ourselves and feel like we don't have to present and perform as much, and maybe relax and be ourselves a little bit more. Maybe that's at home when you're by yourself. Maybe that's when you're in front of the mirror, getting ready to go out and perform a different version of yourself. Singing into the mirror with a hairbrush or something, and not caring too much at the moment what anyone thinks. Goffman doesn't want us to think then that we're completely ourselves then, because we always have some kind of performance going on, but there's kind of different levels of performance in that sense. So I think Goffman's really interesting, and Goffman is also one of those sociologists that's actually quite good to read, so I highly recommend that book for people to have a look at if you're interested in this topic. Okay, I'll leave this section here and move on to the next.